Since the fall of Pride Fighting Championships back in 2007, the UFC has clearly been the premier MMA organization around the world, which means that nearly every big star that has ever fought in the sport has fought for them, with few exceptions. So with so many fighters under their umbrella, near total control of the industry, and a short-tempered president to go along with it, you can imagine how many enemies the UFC has created. And it's a two-way street. Some fighters have threatened to physically attack Dana White, in other cases Dana has completely shut the door on fighters. Some are infamous for obvious reasons. Even the biggest UFC stars have been affected by this. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and today we're looking at the 10 biggest stars the UFC would like to erase. So real quick, I think it's important to note that this isn't the biggest feuds between the UFC and their fighters. You'll see that on another list that we've made. Today we're focusing on the ones that the UFC specifically wants to get rid of and just kind of forget about. Number 10, Brendan Schaub. When you think of fighters who have transitioned successfully into careers after fighting, arguably nobody has done it better than Brendan Schaub. He's now a successful stand-up comedian, has two of the most popular podcasts on YouTube with The Fighter and the Kid and The Big Brown Breakdown. He's occasionally an analyst with Bellator and was the MMA analyst for Showtime during the Mayweather vs. McGregor fight. He also has a show with them now, where his issues began centered around a familiar problem: the Reebok deal. Famously, the Reebok deal has cost fighters tons of cash, and in Brendan Schaub's case, he claims he made at least 6 figures per fight that was lost due to no longer being able to have sponsors on his attire and fight banner. So instead, with the Reebok fight tier, he would make just $10,000. And although retirement was already on the table before this appeared to be what made him finally retire. Of course, publicly stating his issues with the Reebok deal drew the ire of Dana White, the UFC, and Reebok. Dana famously called Brendan a liar, disputing the money he'd made from sponsorships, and fired him from shows like UFC Now and UFC Tonight shortly after. It's safe to say we won't be seeing Brendan Schaub again on a UFC product anytime soon. Number 9, Mike Goldberg. So this entry isn't a UFC fighter, but certainly is one of their best known former stars and personalities. Going all the way back to UFC Japan, Ultimate Japan in 1997, Goldberg was their lead play-by-play commentator until UFC 207 at the end of 2016. But the way he was let go from the company was extremely odd. Out of nowhere, he was informed that his contract wouldn't be renewed on December 1st, 2016. That's less than a month before UFC 207, which aired on December 30th, 2016. The reason? There's never been an actual official statement or anything from the UFC or Dana White other than a confirmation that he was being let go. And to make matters worse, they didn't even mention it at UFC 207 during the broadcast. They simply just didn't address the elephant in the room at all and ended the broadcast like it was a normal show. Even Goldberg's son took to Twitter lashing out against the UFC for treating him so poorly despite 20 years of service and loyalty. It's noteworthy that the WWE tried to snag him as their lead commentator in 2005. And it's even rumored that they wanted to pay him an extra 6 figures if he no-showed a UFC event the week prior. While the jury is certainly out on that, it certainly comes off as very disrespectful to let go of an extremely loyal employee in this fashion. It's very much apparent that they wanted him gone and are totally okay with never mentioning anything about him again. Number 8, Paul Daley. Considering this is one of the most infamous bans on the list, you probably suspect Paul Daley would be ranked higher. But the truth is, at the time of his controversy with the UFC, he was still a new face on the big stage and wasn't really a star at the time. Daley's big misstep that got him blacklisted from the UFC happened back in 2010 after a big fight with his then rival, Josh Koscheck. The two have been placed in a number 1 contenders match for the welterweight strap against Georges St. Pierre, and the two talked a heavy amount of trash going into their fight. Josh Koscheck, having an overwhelming advantage on the ground, decided to avoid striking with a kickboxing expert and resorted to controlling Daley on the ground for 3 rounds. Clearly, when the final bell sounded, Daley wasn't done and sucker punched Koscheck in a fit of rage, to which referee Dan Bergliotta had to jump in and restrain Daley right after. After the fights that night, Dana White immediately fired him and told the press he'd never fight in the UFC again. After 8 years, Dana has not gone back on his word, and there's no indication of reversing this decision. Number 7, John Fitch.
Here's Johnny!
This entry is in some ways just as much about Kung Lee, Dennis Hallman, Nate Corey, and a few others as it is John Fitch, but of the group, in addition to being the most successful fighter as a former title challenger and being undefeated for so many years, was always on the bad side of the UFC and Dana White. Of course, the big thing that connects them all is a class action lawsuit against the company. company. They're essentially looking for alleged lost wages, TV and video game rights, among other issues with the UFC's business practices that they feel they are entitled to. Through John Fitch's entire career though, he was labeled as a boring fighter by fans and President Dana White alike. The problem was that he was just too good. All the way from his first fight in 2005 with the UFC till 2010, Fitch was undefeated aside from his lone loss to George St. Pierre in 2008. It was long thought that he deserved a second title shot in that time, but Dana White was very clearly not a fan of Fitch. So after two losses, one against Johnny Hendricks in 2011 and Damian Maia in 2013, Fitch was promptly let go. Now that this lawsuit is underway and seeking hundreds of millions of dollars, it's clear the UFC would probably just rather he go away and never have fought for them in the first place. Number 6. Chael Sonnen. Without a doubt, Chael Sonnen was one of the most popular fighters in the sport's history between 2010 and 2012. During this time, he rose to fame for having incredibly witty quips and jabs at who unanimously was considered the world's greatest fighter at the time, Anderson Silva. He was a monumental success, garnering 1 million pay-per-view sales in the second fight with Silva. And to his credit, until Weidman eventually came along to dethrone Silva, Sonnen gave him his best challenge to date in their first fight. During this time, Dana White even viewed Sonnen as a possible successor to him as president of the UFC down the line. Those are some pretty high honors, but during this time, Chael managed to fail a couple drug tests, and it's the one in 2014 that caused the UFC to fire Chael from all of his Fox analyst duties and move on to a life away from fighting as he retired from the sport with a 2-year suspension from the Nevada State Athletic Commission. At the end of his suspension in 2016, it was thought he would return to the UFC and come out of retirement, but to everybody's surprise, he signed with rival Bellator, where he competes now and serves as play-by-play commentator for their events. Since then, Chael has been vocal about where he feels Dana has lied and advocates for Bellator beating the UFC in ratings. It's a far fall from being considered a potential replacement for the UFC president's role to now being a direct competitor and outspoken critic. I doubt we'll see the bad guy near the UFC again. Number 5. Wanderlei Silva. You can't find many more popular fighters in the world during his prime. The axe murderer Wanderlei Silva had an incredible tenure in the early days of MMA in Pride. Pretty much fought everybody regardless of weight class and had plenty of knockouts to his name. Even though his record wasn't the best in his return to the UFC starting back in 2007, he had some incredible fights with Chuck Liddell, Kung Lee, and Brian Stann. Truly a legend of the sport. Where things got dicey though was when the Nevada State Athletic Commission tried to randomly drug test him ahead of his highly anticipated bout with Chael Sonnen in 2014. Wanderlei did refuse and was banned for life by the Nevada Commission, which was a completely ridiculous ruling. It didn't make any sense to just ban somebody for life like that. During this time, Wanderlei wanted to be released by the UFC so he could go and fight in other countries where they didn't have jurisdiction over him, but the UFC refused. So Wanderlei went apeshit and started accusing them of fixing fights and being sport killers. Basically, if it could be proved that the UFC fixes fights, then the promotion would lose their promoter's license and be shut down for good. So this was a huge deal and the UFC treated it like that. Thankfully though, Wanderlei's lifetime ban was overturned by a judge calling the INSAC's punishment arbitrary and capricious, which might be the best shutdown the INSAC has ever been served to date. But as a result of this, tempers calmed down between him and the UFC. He backed down from his statements and they released him from his contract. It's safe to say though that despite this being one of the most popular fighters ever, UFC wants nothing to do with him ever again. Number 4. Tim Sylvia. Man, where do we even start with this one? Tim Sylvia is a 2-time former heavyweight champion for the promotion and fought in the organization between 2002 and 2008. To his credit, he was only pro for 2 years when he defeated Rico Rodriguez at UFC 41 in 2003 for the title. One of the reasons for his unpopularity certainly started from his failed drug test at UFC 44, where he was stripped of the title, where he also lost to who was seen as the best of the division, Frank Mir, and would later get in a car wreck that took him out of competition after that. So as a result, you had Tim Sylvia fighting Arlovsky 3 times in an awful trilogy. And then after that, he lost to Randy Couture, who was 43 at the time. His title reign and defenses were seen as a low point in heavyweight competition for the UFC, as he lost the aforementioned Frank Mir early in his career, lost to the returning Randy Couture in 2007, Big Nog just after, and Fedor when released by the UFC in Affliction. But it was his losses after that really made things even worse, as he famously was knocked out by Ray Mercer, a boxer who was long after his prime. Despite all the issues between Dana and Couture, he even went as far as to call Couture's win of Sylvia the day the heavyweight division was saved. It's clear Dana has never been a fan of Sylvia and would rather forget the entire era of the heavyweight division between 2003 and 2007. Number 3, Rico Rodriguez. So who is Rico Rodriguez, you might be wondering? Well, if you go back to 2003, he'd beaten Gary Goodridge, Andrei Arlovski, Jeff Monson, and most famously Randy Couture, where he won the UFC Heavyweight Championship. Despite having these big wins against former champions and legends, he nearly took down the UFC when it was its most vulnerable, and the reason is insane. Basically, from the time that Fertitas bought the UFC and installed Dana White in 2001, all the way until they managed to land a TV deal on Spike TV in 2005, UFC was on hard financial times, and it was losing millions and millions of dollars each year. This also meant that fighters weren't getting paid as much as they are now, and were totally getting beaten out by rival organizations like Pride. So despite fighting on the main event for the heavyweight championship, Rico Rodriguez was eager to make more sponsorship money. So before looking to win his title fight against Randy Couture, he decided to get a henna tattoo or temporary tattoo with a sponsor's name on it. The problem? It was Golden Palace. And of course they were fighting in the Mohegan Sun, which is a rival casino. So the Mohegan Sun was incredibly offended and wanted to shut down the entire event, which back in those days would have been way too much money for the UFC to just swallow. An example of this happening with another organization was Josh Barnett testing positive for steroids just days before his fight against Fedor and Affliction, and as a result of them having to cancel the event in the wake of that, they couldn't recover and Affliction went back to only selling douchey, shitty clothing. So because of this one event, you'll never see Rico Rodriguez near the octagon again or the Hall of Fame, and likely won't ever hear him mentioned by Dana or anyone else in the UFC. Number 2, Randy Couture. Captain America, Joe Rogan's hero. When you think of a legendary figure in MMA, most pale in comparison. A guy who's incredibly professional and respectful, an Olympic level athlete with multiple title reigns in 2 weight divisions. On top of that, he was game to fight anybody and any organization. He didn't worry about taking quote unquote money fights like many top stars in the sport campaign for now, but rather he just wanted to fight the best in the world, even if that meant going to a smaller promotion outside of the UFC. These are really the ingredients of what makes a fighter so popular and why legends of his era are so highly regarded still today. In his case, he was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame 5 years before he even retired. So why in the world would the UFC and Dana White have an issue with one of their most revered athletes? Well, it actually has to do with that fighting anyone, anywhere mentality. Couture tried to leave his contract so he could do what we all wanted to see, fight who is then considered the world's pound for pound best fighter and who some would say is the greatest fighter ever, Fedor Emelianenko. In addition to this, he claimed the UFC was withholding fighter pay and bonuses among other things. So this led to a bitter court battle in which the UFC was able to win based on the strength of their contract that kept him from leaving the UFC. To make the controversy even worse, he was the heavyweight champion during all of this. So for nearly a year in 2007 to 2008, he and the UFC were at total odds. But he finally signed a new deal with the UFC to solve their grievances and fight Brock Lesnar. We all know by now he lost that fight, but would continue to fight for the UFC until 2011, and he even got a hero's welcome by the UFC before doing so. So you'd think that means things ended well, but shortly after retiring, the feud again heated up as he signed a promotional contract to work with rival Bellator and coach on their short-lived Ultimate Fighter style TV show. Sure enough, Dana started coming out with some heavy comments, saying things like,
Randy Couture comes off as the greatest guy in the world, Captain America. He's the furthest thing from it, and I'm happy to not be in business with him anymore.
Pretty hard to erase a guy who's in your Hall of Fame, but Dana White's made it clear that he will never work with him again, and although Randy's done a lot for the sport, would just as well forget about it all. Before we get to number 1, I'd like to reiterate that this isn't about feuds between fighters and the UFC. I'll do a quick honorable mentions list of some of the other names that you might expect to see here and why they essentially have not been on this list, and how they have essentially made up with Dana since then.
I said, when I saw her at the MMA Awards, she looked like Wanderlei Silva in a dress and heels. And she did.
We've made some mistakes when it comes to Cyborg.
He could really give a shit about anybody else but himself. I could care less about anybody but me, and that's why Josh Barnett isn't and never will be in the UFC.
Much as you'd probably love to hear me throw that guy under the bus or something, Dana doesn't, I don't think it's anything like that. It's really just all a matter of how it lined up business-wise for both parties. So,
is it the most wasted talent you've possibly ever seen in sports?
Ever. In all of sports, yeah. The guy is so talented and gifted. God knows what he'd be doing right now. You know, it's crazy you asking me about John. John and I talked yesterday for the first time.
Oh, really?
It's for the first time since his last fight. Ken Shamrock owes me $175,000. And I'm coming for it, Ken.
First thing we do is we start talking, just immediately say some things that are negative. And I think it was just built into our DNA for so many years. And so it was just time for us to really bury that and start doing the right thing for MMA.
The stuff between Tito and I is very real. You know, this is no bullshit. We're not trying to, put on a WWE show. It's very real.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to induct the new member to the UFC Hall of Fame, Tito Ortiz.
Number 1, Frank Shamrock. Frank is the former and first champion of what would now be considered light heavyweight, or what was then called middleweight back when he won it. He's had incredible fights not just in the UFC but also in Pancrase, most notably with Boss Rutan, and has also fought in Vale Tudo Japan, Elite XC, Strikeforce, and many others. While in the UFC, he was considered one of the greatest fighters ever, if not the greatest fighter in the world during that time. And his fight with Tito Ortiz is one of the absolute best in the entire sport's history, let alone the UFC. Despite this, the UFC refused to acknowledge that fight in their top 100 fights ever, and although Frank Shamrock is undoubtedly a pioneer and was considered the first complete mixed martial artist by many, has been snubbed every year from the UFC Hall of Fame. Other contemporaries with similar accomplishments like Boss Rutan, Murray Smith, and even Sakuraba, who only fought in the UFC during one event, made that list. But still, they won't give him the time of day. So why won't they include him in their history books? Well, the answer is kind of frustrating. They've largely kept what started the rift quiet. We don't really know what started it all, but they've certainly said enough about one another to where we know how they feel.
You're a two-faced lion chump. That's what you are, Frank Shamrock.
Without a doubt, Frank Shamrock deserves to be in the Hall of Fame as a guy who went 5-0, won the first light heavyweight championship, and was a pioneer who dominated the sport's best during his day. There's no reason he should be forgotten and ignored like he is in the UFC history books.